Brazil's president reshuffles his cabinet, hoping to shore up his popularity. But there's growing public discontent. Jair Bolsonaro stands accused of mishandling the COVID-19 pandemic, and angry protesters say he should step down. So, who's likely to win this battle? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Rob Matheson. Brazil's president is under pressure again. During the course of this year, Jair Bolsonaro managed to unite left-wing parties, trade unions and social organisations because they're trying to get him impeached. He's mainly accused of mishandling the pandemic and possibly being responsible for the deaths of thousands of people. Brazilians have also accused him of corruption, a disregard for the environment and policies they say are fueling the economic crisis. In his latest response, Bolsonaro announced a government reshuffle, but that's only angered more people who say the president is a threat to democracy.
I am here against this government that I consider genocidal, responsible for not purchasing vaccines, and many people died for a lack of vaccines that the government did not buy.
I am here claiming the right of all Brazilians, the right to democracy, without fascism and Bolsonaro out. Nobody can stand this genocide in the country anymore.
I'm for the Amazon, for the Indians, and for the truth, and that's why I'm here. Because Bolsonaro is a liar. I didn't vote for him, but I also didn't think he would be so genocidal.
We're going to go to our guests in a moment, but first let's take a look at Bolsonaro's presidency. The populist and conservative president took office in 2019 after defeating leftists who'd ruled for decades. His victory was seen as part of growing support for the far right in many countries. He's been criticised for favouring torture and praising the nation's former dictatorship. His comments on race, gender and sexual orientation have also provoked controversy. The president has labelled coronavirus a little flu. He's pushed for quarantine measures to be lifted and sent contradictory messages about masks and social distancing. And he's been sued by indigenous leaders at the International Criminal Court for damage caused by his environmental policies. Okay, let's bring in our guests. Joining us from Sao Paulo, we have Jeraldo Zahran. He's an author, Brazilian political analyst. And in New Haven, in Connecticut, we have Nizar Messari. He's an associate professor at international studies at Akhawayn University. And also from Sao Paulo, we have Claudio Couto, who's a political scientist. He's also associate professor at the Jetulio Vargas Foundation. Welcome to you all, gentlemen. Nizar Messari, I want to start with you. What do you think the president is trying to achieve with this reshuffle?
Well, one of his main objectives is to establish himself to keep being president until the next elections. So there are attempts of impeaching him, as you said in your introduction note, and by driving this reshuffle and then by bringing a key ally to Ciro Nogueira to his government, he wants to confirm his alliance with what is called in Brazil Central, and to avoid any attempt of impeaching him. So this is from my point of view, his main objective. An alternative objective is to allow him to counter more effectively the narrative that is being driven by the COVID inquiry commission at the Senate. One of the very indirect consequences of this reshuffle is that his son will be sitting as a potential participant in the commission. So, this will allow him to defend himself and his narrative in fighting the COVID pandemic in Brazil. So these are his two main objectives. There are others, but for the time being, it's a strategy of survival rather than a strategy of aiming at the long run and at winning the elections.
Jeraldo Zahran, we hear a lot, of course, about the people in Brazil who are opposed to the president. Let's talk about the support that he has. What is the state of Bolsonaro's support in Brazil at the moment, do you think?
think he reached a floor. He's standing on the support of the hardliners, the extreme right supporters that's probably make up about 15–20% of the electorate, depending on how you measure it. These people are people that benefit. They're policemen, they're firemen, they're people in the military. There's some ruralists, people that benefit from his policies, some Christian evangelicals that align with his conservative ideas. And for this core group of supporters, they're with Bolsonaro until the end. It doesn't really matter much what he does or what he says, if he contradicts himself, or even the impact, the results of his policies. These people just have been following him since the beginning, and they think they'll stick with him until the end.
Claudio, Couto, in the changes in opinion about the president that we have seen in Brazil over the last 12 months, say, how much of that is down to people who were opposed to him in the first place? And how much of it is people who had voted for him, do you think, who are now seeing a different side or choosing to interpret what he's doing differently?
I think that when we consider the polls that show the popularity or the loss of popularity of Bolsonaro, we can say that about a half of his former voters in 2018 now don't support him. This is what the numbers show to us. And it has to do, of course, with his behavior as a president, and he has a very peculiar kind of behavior. He's a very aggressive president. He doesn't respect the tradition of the behavior that other presidents had in terms of how to talk with people, how to talk with representatives of other branches of the government. And it has to do, of course, again, with the policies, and mainly in this case, the policies regarding health and the policies regarding how Bolsonaro dealt with the pandemics, not only in terms of sabotaging all the time the measures that were necessary to keep people apart one from the other in terms of health security measures, but also in terms of acquiring vaccines or prescribing medicines that really don't work, and even they have prejudicial consequences for the people. And so if we consider this whole thing, we can say that people now evaluate Bolsonaro worse than they used to do before. As Jeraldo said before me, he still relies his support on a very hardcore that is comprised by far-right people, by some extremist people from the security forces, and these are now something like 20% of the Brazilian population. Since he had more than 50% of the votes, we can say that he lost the support of at least 30% of Brazilians.
For those of us who don't follow Brazilian politics closely, what were things like in Brazil when the election took place and Jair Bolsonaro was put in place?
Well, I think that Bolsonaro, he was elected because he presented himself at that time as a kind of outsider. It's very difficult to say that Bolsonaro is a real outsider. Bolsonaro is much more a marginal insider than properly an outsider. Since he was a federal representative for 28 years, all his sons are members of the political class. One of them is a senator right now. The other one is, again, a federal deputy. The other one is a city councilor. And so Bolsonaro was a member of the system, but he was able to present himself as an outsider. And since there was a widespread feeling about the politics in Brazil in terms of reacting against the traditional political parties, against the traditional politics, against the representative institutions that don't work properly according to the perception of the Brazilian people, Bolsonaro presents himself as one that will destroy everything to rebuild it in a different manner. And now, with this reshuffle in his government, we can see that, well, he's not doing that.
Nizar, Messari, let's talk about this reshuffle. Given the fact that he appears to be able to... Actually, I'm going to come on to Jeraldo Zahran, because, Jeraldo, you wanted to make it a point there.
Yeah, if I may jump in to the last question and looking forward, in our last election in 2018, we're also coming out of years of the consequences of the Lava Jato scandal, the car wash Lava Jato operation that dealt with corruption in the political system, marginalized the Workers' Party, PT. Many of some of the politicians were arrested, particularly President Lula, former President Lula. At that time, in 2018, Lula was leading the polls, and it's a counterfactual, but it's likely that he would go to a runoff with Bolsonaro if he was allowed. Of course, his political rights were denied. Also at that time, we had, before the election, we had this sense that the more traditional right-wing establishment or center right-wing establishment would put forward a candidate in the person of Jeraldo Zahran. He had a very broad coalition of parties supporting him. He had a lot of TV time, which is a big deal in Brazilian politics. So there was this sense for many politicians from the establishment, for some TV analysts, that the center-right would come true, that all this operation to put Lula aside and put the Workers' Party aside, all the rage, the anger against the left-wing government, that would lead to a more mainstream establishment right-wing candidate coming to power. And then that's completely not what happened. Claudio just described how Bolsonaro was elected coming from the fringes, coming from the outside. But in a sense, that's still the same predicament we face ourselves today. Lula's political rights were reinstated. He might run next year. Bolsonaro, of course, was a very strong political force. And the center or the right wings or center-right coalition is completely lost. They don't know exactly what to do. They don't know if they align themselves with Bolsonaro. They don't know if they try to promote a new candidate. So all of this will play out next year.
Jeraldo, thank you. I want to come on to Nizar Messari, go back to the question that I was going to ask, which is about the reshuffle itself. With the appointment or this move towards including more centrist candidates within his cabinet, within his organization, is it a risk, do you think, that Bolsonaro himself risks undermining his own authority, if you like, if he essentially dilutes the level of power that he has by having to move it out to other people in order to be able to appease his opponents?
Absolutely. Perfect question, and you're absolutely right. As he deepens his alliance with this group of Brazilian politicians, who are reputed of being among the most corrupt fringe in Brazilian politics, he contradicts, first of all, his message of 2018, when he ran as the candidate who would bring honesty to politics. So he contradicts that. Not only he contradicts that message from 2018, but he put himself at the mercy of this group of politicians who do politics the traditional way and who will bargain for every single support or supportive votes they will give the government, and which weakens the government, will weaken the government further and further, which means that this group of politicians will not care about improving the economy or the social standing of the population. What matters to them are their own interests and their survival. So as long as they are serving their own interests, this group of politicians will provide Bolsonaro with support. And this support will not mean that Bolsonaro will improve his performance as president. It will only mean that this group of politicians will be providing him with the support he needs to avoid impeachment, in counterpart of which they will be serving their own interests. So this is the conundrum in which Bolsonaro finds himself right now.
Claudio, let me just interrupt, because I want to go on to Claudio Couto and go back to a point that Jeraldo was making with regard to the elections that we're going to be seeing in several months' time. Jeraldo was saying that one of the problems was that the opposition had relied so much on Bolsonaro's lack of electability, in a sense, that they were concentrating on different things. They essentially took their eye off the ball because they didn't think that Bolsonaro was going to get elected. Do you think that the opposition in Brazil has changed enough and realized their mistake, their previous mistake enough to be able to be a cohesive force against a Bolsonaro run in about a year's time?
Well, I think they did. But the point is that we don't have just one opposition, but we have different sectors of the opposition today. Perhaps the more competitive sector is the one represented by Lula, the left, the traditional left in Brazil. And there is another sector that now people call that the third way, which would be something in the middle of Lula and Bolsonaro. It can be a centrist candidate, it can be a moderate rightist candidate. We don't know exactly what it is. But these guys, they know that they must be competitive against Bolsonaro. They can occupy his space in the political dispute next year. It's impossible for this group to occupy the space that is already occupied by Lula from the left until the center left and even a part of the center. And so it's very important for this sector of the political spectrum to weaken Bolsonaro even more in order to occupy this space. The point is that we don't have just one candidate, and so there is not an unified capacity of competition for the next elections. And besides that, there is also a difficulty in presenting a real competitive and appealing candidate. It's not only a problem with the demand. We have a demand for a centrist or a centrist rightist candidate, but we don't have a candidate that can fill this blank and is capable of convincing people that they are a best alternative than the other two candidates. But they really realized that Bolsonaro was not only a freak, as some people perceived in 2018, that it would be impossible for him to be elected, considering, for example, the things that he said. I would say that he was elected because of the things that he said, since these things that are the ones that allow him to present himself as a real opposer of the establishment. But now he is establishment, and he's a different kind of establishment. So these people can present themselves as an anti-Bolsonaro, but it depends on what part of the position we are talking about.
Jeraldo Zahran, we've talked briefly earlier about the involvement of the security services, the support that he has from the military and so on. I want to ask you about how the military in Brazil views a Bolsonaro presidency, and do you think that there's any possibility the military might intervene if it looked as though a Bolsonaro presidency was going to fail?
That's a great question, and I'm glad you asked it. I think one of the consequences of the cabinet reshuffle we saw is a downplay of the role of the military in Bolsonaro's government. Don't get me wrong, Bolsonaro has thousands of military officials in civilian posts, is the most number of military men in the government since the dictatorship. It even suppresses what we had in our military dictatorship here. He has a very strong support from the military and from the military leaders, from the Minister of Defense, from the chief of the forces. But in putting Ciro Nogueira and in bringing these coalitions of parties, he's giving the driving seat of the government to the politicians, not to the military. That alliance, though, will not go away. He still has strong support from the military, from the leaders. He recently shuffled positions from the branches in the Navy, in the Army. And there seems to be, or what we hear from the military is at least this leadership, they would not stand for a renewed Lula government, for a Lula election, which is a countersense, right? That's not their option. It's like putting democracy in the hostage seat. But we have been getting these signals.
Nizar,
it is conceivable, and I think it.
Sorry to interrupt, but I wanted to ask Nizar Messari about the fact that I would imagine that given that Brazil only emerged from a military dictatorship back in 1985, how fresh is that in the Brazilian mind when they see the way that Jair Bolsonaro and his government are operating?
It's somehow still fresh in people's memories. And one of the things that saves Bolsonaro from impeachment is the fact that his vice president is another nut. He's a general, a retired general. And people, some sectors are concerned that if Bolsonaro is impeached, it will be Mourão who will become president, and Mourão brings more the military institution even than Bolsonaro, because he's a general, he's a retired general, and the military, and he is part of a fringe of the military that defines the military as a moderating force in Brazilian politics, as the agency that intervenes when things go bad, when things go south. So if he is empowered as president, there is a major risk for Brazilian politics and Brazilian democracy. So this is still fresh in people's memory, and many politicians would refrain from impeaching Bolsonaro because of the risk that of bringing the military back to power in 2021.
I think perhaps Jair Bolsonaro's deputy may take issue with being called a nut, but we'll move on from there. Let me talk about the elections that are coming up. Now, Jair Bolsonaro is getting increasingly critical about the election process in Brazil. Is it too much of a coincidence to suggest that this is happening while his approval ratings are plummeting? Claudio, Couto.
Yeah, this is exactly what has happened. Since Bolsonaro realized that it will be very difficult for him to win the next elections, he says all the time that the political system of elections, it doesn't work properly, it's not reliable, that frauds had already opened. Today, for example, he will present some evidence. He says that there are some evidence that there was a fraud, a major political fraud, in the elections of 2014, when Dilma Rousseff was elected instead of Aécio Neves, the oppositor then. Even Aécio Neves don't think this way. He recognized that there were fair elections. But this is not a novelty in terms of Bolsonaro. Even sometime before the elections of 2018, he was already talking about these problems that doesn't exist. We don't have evidence of that in the political system of elections. I think that the main problem for Bolsonaro is not only discrediting the electoral institutions in case of he lose the election, but is also a part of his general perspective or his general strategy of weakening political institutions of Brazilian democracy. And since one of the most important institutions of Brazilian democracy are the electoral system and the electoral institutions, it's very important for him to weaken this kind of thing. Even
Nizar
during
Messari,
the military dictatorship.
let me ask Nizar Messari this, because we're getting close to the end of the program. For those who are opposing Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil, is taking to the streets and registering their protest publicly the only thing they can do? Is there any other mechanism, apart from political impeachment, that can be used to remove Jair Bolsonaro by the public, or do they have to wait for the elections? Briefly, if you would, sir.
Politically, from my personal point of view, the safest bet is to wait for the elections, because pursuing impeachment or other strategies might allow Bolsonaro for a victimization process that would allow him to regain some credibility with his followers. So from my own point of view, the best way to deal with this is just to wait for elections and vote him out.
Right, we're going to leave it there. Thank you very much to all our guests. Jeraldo Zahran, author, Brazilian political analyst from Sao Paulo. Nizar Messari, Associate Professor of International Studies at Akhawayn University from New Haven in Connecticut, and also from Sao Paulo. Claudio Couto, political scientist and Associate Professor at the Jetulio Vargas Foundation. And thank you to you too for watching. You can see the program again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. For me, Rob Matheson, and the whole team, bye for now.